I received a note from a viewer of the show that said, "Tiago, I love your videos that showcase a federal retirement plan and how all the pieces of the plan come together. One thing I can't figure out is how to determine exactly how much money is needed to start retirement. I've seen rules of thumb, but it's evident by your videos that the magic number is different for everyone, and the rules of thumb don't work well. How do you determine how much your clients need? Thanks in advance, John." This is a really great question because everyone considering retirement has asked this question. How much do I need to be able to retire? And he's right, it does depend. But there is a way to figure out how much someone needs to have as a starting point if they're considering retirement, and that's what I'm going to cover in today's video. I'm going to go over exactly how we figure out how much somebody needs to be able to retire, how to factor inflation and rising costs, how your investment strategy affects the results, and by the end of this video, you'll have a good sense for how to determine your magic number. There's a lot that goes into figuring out this number, but you want to start by asking yourself a few questions. First, what kind of lifestyle do I want when I retire? Am I going to be doing more of something like traveling or maybe a hobby? And how much do I think that lifestyle is going to cost? How much income will I need to support that lifestyle? Also, while I can figure out a starting value for my TSP or portfolio, what happens as that number starts to change as I use my money, or because maybe the markets are changing the portfolio's balance? We'll start with figuring out the initial number, and then the second half of the video will incorporate things like taxes, inflation, changes in life, and others. So first, let's talk about your starting number. We always want to start with figuring out what our cash flows, or the heartbeat of retirement, are going to look like. This is an example of a cash flow report that we create for clients, and on the top we have cash inflows, and on the bottom we've got cash outflows. So we can tell here that this family has liabilities, which is mostly their mortgage, about $2,500 a month or so. And they've got a car purchase that they're looking at making here in a couple of years. They also have some home renovations planned for looks like 4 years from now. And then we've got some insurance and living expenses. This category here is what everything else falls under. So this is going out and maybe some traveling, groceries, their cell phone bill, everything else. So it looks like this family is spending about $8,000 to maintain their lifestyle. Now note that I'm not showing any TSP or portfolio distributions here. This is just the pension income that's coming in. Portfolio would come in after the fact. Now that's also why taxes show so low here, because remember, pre-tax TSP withdrawals are taxed just like a salary. So now that we know how much they're spending, or what we call their burn rate, let's see how much of it is being made up by Social Security and their FERS pension. When we go back to the cash flow report here, we've got FERS as a federal pension coming in at about $43,000 a year. Now this retiree is also getting the special retirement supplement, so they will get that for a couple of years until they turn 62. So it could be that in this year, may actually be that they don't get a full year of that supplement. We may have to look at that. And of course, we don't have Social Security starting yet, because if they were to take it at 62, it would be much too soon and it would be significantly reduced. So if we push this out 5 more years, you would see Social Security kicking in. Now remember that this pension amount is the gross amount. So we have things like survivor benefit pension, that's either 5 or 10%. That's going to be withdrawn for that. We have FEHB premiums that have to come out of this. Ordinary income tax, so federal and state taxes, also have to come out. So the amount that they would receive in the bank or their take-home pay would be much less than this. Those outflows are incorporated into these categories here on the bottom. Now, this is another way of looking at the information, only it's a graphical illustration. We've got withdrawals plus the pension coming in. This is where the withdrawals come into play, where you can see they're going to need some substantial withdrawals to make up their lifestyle expenses before Social Security kicks in, which is this navy color here. And then, of course, their portfolio withdrawals turn orange as required minimum distributions begin. So I'm just showing you this as an example so you start to get a feel for the different ways to be thinking about your cash flow. So now that you have an idea of what a cash flow report looks like, let's do a simplified example together, and then we'll figure out how much starting balance they're going to need. So let's say we have a family bringing in about $230,000 a year, and let's say that it covers all of their lifestyle expenses. So once they retire, they're probably going to be spending a similar amount that they're spending pre-retirement, but of course they're not going to have things like retirement account contributions, maybe some liabilities will be paid off, things like that. So let's assume that $50,000 between two of them is being contributed to their retirement accounts and TSP. So we'll remove that from there. And that leaves us with about $180,000. And now we also want to take out taxes because not all of this is spendable money. And for simplicity's sake, we're just going to assume an effective rate of 30%, federal, state, local, miscellaneous. I know it's a little high, but just to make the math simple. So at 70% net after tax amount, that leaves us with about $126,000 worth of needs. Again, the numbers don't matter so much here, as does the format and the way that I'm kind of thinking about this, because this is how I want you to be thinking about your own retirement plan. Now we have to figure out what the FERS pension is going to be bringing in, and for the sake of this example, we will call it $3,000 a month, so $36,000. Which takes us down to $90,000 of income needs from the portfolio. Now, eventually Social Security is going to start, which means their draw requirements from the portfolio are not going to be as much as this, but they do have a higher withdrawal need for a few years until then. So when we break this down, we're looking at about $7,500 per month in portfolio withdrawals that we have to factor in until Social Security starts, then it will go down. But we also want to think about things like one-time expenses or spontaneous trips or anything that is a little bit out of the ordinary. We just want to make sure that there's a cushion when we think about this number. Now let's say Social Security begins and it reduces their income need down to $4,000 a month that they're going to need to support their needs. So now we finally have the number they need each month from their portfolio and can work backwards to figure out how much should be in the portfolio. So many people will think, okay, well, if we're retired for 30 years and we've got 12 months in a year, we basically multiply that together and get our answer, right? Not quite. Why would that not be the right answer? Well, because they may need $4,000 in today's dollars, but what happens over time? That $4,000 is actually going to go up because inflation is going to begin to erode the purchasing power and the cost of things slowly increase over time. So over time, they're actually going to need more than $4,000 a month to keep up with inflation. So you can see it's not just a simple multiplication problem to figure out how much you need in your portfolio. And here's how we actually figure out that amount. Let's assume that inflation is 3% annualized over time and your portfolio can earn 7%. The question then is, what is your inflation adjusted real rate of return? Most people think 7 minus 3 equals 4% return after inflation. That's close, but it's not quite the actual number. And the longer you project this out, the more inaccurate it will be if you have the wrong number. Your real rate of return is actually slightly lower. Now, here is your math warning. There is a formula that we use for this, but I promise it's easy, so just stick with me, okay? The way to calculate your after inflation amount is we want to add 1 to your after-tax return, right? This is the return that you're getting. And then we also want to add 1 to inflation minus 1 times 100. That just gets you the percentage. So let's do an example so that you can understand how to do this for yourself. If we say we have a return of 7% and we have inflation of 3%, well, what does this look like? 1.07 over 1.03 minus 1 times 100. And I will save you from doing the math. I did it right before I started this. That equals to 3.8%. So you can see it's almost the 4% that we calculated earlier here, but it's slightly less. Now you think, that's not a big difference. Why can't I just use 4%? Again, when you start to compound this over time, it does make a pretty big difference. So you want to make sure you have the right number in your formula, which is going to be important here in just 1 second. So with different amounts of withdrawals required, where it's higher some years, lower other years, when you factor in inflation on top, it can get pretty calculated to illustrate. So for the sake of simplicity, let's say that you're just going to need an average of $60,000 a year for the rest of your life. So we've got $60K, so about $5,000 per month. And again, we'll assume FERS and Social Security are already factored in just for simplicity's sake. And let's assume they live until 90 and they're retiring at 60. So that's 30 years that they're going to need $60,000 a year. And we just determined that our inflation adjusted rate of return is actually 3.8%, which is a 7% annualized before you factor in inflation. So with these 3 factors, how do we calculate how much we need as a starting base in our portfolio? Well, if we need a monthly payment to ourselves of $60,000 a year, so $5,000 a month, we've got an interest rate of 3.8 inflation adjusted, and N equals the number of years that we need this for, so 30 years. And with these 3 variables, you can calculate what we call your time value of money calculation, which if you plug this into a financial calculator or Excel or software, then you get a present value. In other words, the amount of money you need today, which equals $1,063,188. So that means that if you have about $1.1 million in your portfolio when you start retirement, you earn an annualized 7% on this money, inflation averages about 3%, then you can withdraw about $60,000 a year, and in 30 years, your portfolio will reach $0. So to illustrate this, we've got your age starting at 60 to 90, and your portfolio starting at $1 million. As you make those withdrawals by age 90, you will have depleted that account. So you had enough income for all of those years factored into inflation, growing at a certain rate, all the way through age 90. But wait a minute, isn't that cutting it close for a retirement plan, having $0 by age 90? Yeah, absolutely. I showed you a mathematical way of backing into how much a portfolio should be under these various assumptions, but the reality is that people's lives are much different than a simple financial model. What happens if you spend more or less than you originally thought? What happens if you earn more or less on your investments? What if your life changes and you want to move to a different home? What if you want to fund your grandchildren's education because this isn't something you realized you wanted to do prior? What if tax laws change and now your distribution plan has been affected? Or any other number of curveballs that life might throw at you? You need to build enough of a cushion to be able to weather the different things that come our way during retirement so that it doesn't create too much stress on your portfolio. So in our example, this family probably needed closer to $1.5 million or more so that in case the markets fell sharply or other things happened in their lives, they wouldn't have to change their plans so drastically. Now, I also don't want you to feel discouraged about your savings. Remember, this is just a mathematical calculation for an immediate retirement with no other variables introduced. Many of my clients come to me with a good amount of savings, but their retirement plan is not exactly where it needs to be for them to be able to retire yet. Regardless, there's a lot of strategies and changes that we can implement in their plan, which would allow them to be able to retire sooner and have possibly a more meaningful retirement than if we were to back into a numerical number that they needed to have to retire. There are a lot more variables that influence the success of a retirement plan beyond just the amount in your portfolio. In fact, good performance can't fix bad retirement planning. So it's arguably more important that you have the other parts of your retirement plan, like your distribution and tax plan, so that they are supporting your portfolio in the savings that you do have. This is what's going to extend a retirement and allow someone to stay on the trajectory. But obviously you can see doing a manual calculation for each one of these scenarios can be quite unwieldy. So this is where software becomes incredibly helpful because we're able to help walk clients through different scenarios and incorporating different changes to see what's going to be required for the success of each phase of retirement. And beyond that, once you have a starting number that you know you need to have roughly in your portfolio to retire, then what amount is going to be required so that you can stay retired through the various ups and downs that you'll inevitably encounter. We can't control the markets, but we can control how we use the markets as a tool to help us reach our retirement goals. We know we need to be invested to outpace inflation and replace some of our spending, but we don't want to be too aggressive that it creates extra risk in our portfolio and now derails our retirement. Taking too much of a growth approach can actually change the trajectory of the original plan that you thought you were on. Now, you should know that I oversimplified a lot of concepts in this video today for the sake of being able to illustrate how to approach this question. There's a lot of details I glossed over, so it's really important that before you make decisions like retiring and no longer working, that you're talking to your financial planners about the same kinds of things. But my hope is that this gave you a foundation to understand how you should be approaching this question so that you can be doing the same kind of planning. So if you found this video helpful, then consider subscribing to the channel and maybe share it with one of your colleagues. And until next time, stay wise and stay wealthy.